On a snowy Christmas Eve, lights twinkled, laughter filled the air, and 7-year-old Maya O'Neill's innocence was stolen in the shadows of her own home. Her uncle, a respected police chief, hid a monstrous secret behind his smile. But when Maya's silence breaks, her father, SHAQ O'Neil, unleashes a storm of justice that will shake the world. Before continuing this story, let us know where are you watching from. Also, subscribe the channel for notification of daily upcoming stories like this. Let's begin the story. The O'Neil family home was alive with the magic of Christmas Eve. The air smelled of pine trees, gingerbread cookies, and the rich aroma of roasted turkey. Golden lights twinkled on the Christmas tree, and the sound of laughter echoed through the halls. SHAQ O'Neil, the towering basketball legend, stood in the kitchen, wearing an apron that looked comically small on his massive frame. He was helping his wife, Shawnee, prepare the holiday feast, though his main job seemed to be sneaking bites of food when she wasn't looking. "SHAQ, stop eating the mashed potatoes," Shawnee scolded, swatting his hand with a wooden spoon. "What? I'm just making sure they're good enough for my family," SHAQ said with a grin, his deep voice booming through the room. Their 7-year-old daughter, Maya, giggled from the doorway. She was dressed in a red velvet dress with a matching bow in her hair, looking every bit like a Christmas angel. Her dark eyes sparkled with excitement as she ran into the kitchen, wrapping her arms around her father's leg. "Daddy, when can we open presents?" Maya asked, looking up at him with a hopeful smile. SHAQ scooped her up effortlessly, balancing her on his hip. "Not until tomorrow, baby girl. Santa hasn't even come yet." "But what if he forgets our house?" Maya asked, her tiny brow furrowing with worry. SHAQ laughed, a warm, comforting sound. "Forget? Maya, Santa knows where the O'Neills live. He wouldn't dare skip us." The doorbell rang and Maya squirmed out of her father's arms, running to answer it. "Uncle Andrew's here," she shouted, her voice filled with excitement. Andrew, SHAQ's younger brother, stepped inside, carrying a tray of desserts. He was a tall, handsome man with a confident smile and a commanding presence. As a police chief, he was used to being in control, and it showed in the way he carried himself. His wife, Lisa, followed behind him, holding a bottle of wine. "Merry Christmas, everyone," Andrew said, setting the tray down on the counter. "Uncle Andrew!" Maya squealed, jumping into his arms. "Hey, little princess," Andrew said, spinning her around before setting her down. "You've gotten so big. What are they feeding you?" Maya giggled, her cheeks turning pink. "Daddy lets me eat all the cookies." "Of course he does," Andrew said, ruffling her hair. The house quickly filled with more family members, cousins, aunts, uncles, and close friends. The living room was a whirlwind of activity, with children playing games, adults chatting, and Christmas music playing softly in the background. Maya was in her element, running around with her cousins, playing hide-and-seek, and sneaking candy canes from the tree. As the evening went on, the family gathered around the dining table for dinner. SHAQ sat at the head of the table, his deep laugh filling the room, as he told stories about his basketball days. Maya sat between her parents, her plate piled high with food. She looked around the table, her heart swelling with happiness. This was her favorite time of year, when her family was all together, laughing and loving each other. But as the night wore on, Maya began to feel tired. She yawned, rubbing her eyes as she leaned against her mother. "Someone's ready for bed," Shawnee said, brushing a strand of hair from Maya's face. "No, I'm not sleepy," Maya protested, though her drooping eyelids betrayed her. "How about we get you into your pajamas, and you can lie down on the couch for a little bit," SHAQ suggested. Maya nodded, too tired to argue. SHAQ carried her upstairs, helping her change into her favorite unicorn pajamas. He tucked her into a cozy blanket on the couch, kissing her forehead. "Good night, baby girl. Santa's coming soon, so you better be asleep," he whispered. Maya smiled, her eyes already closing. "Good night, Daddy." Downstairs, the party continued. Andrew sat in the living room sipping a glass of wine and chatting with SHAQ. His eyes occasionally flicked toward the couch where Maya slept, his expression unreadable. "She's growing up so fast," Andrew said, his voice low. "Too fast," SHAQ agreed, his tone bittersweet. "I just want to keep her little forever, you know?" Andrew nodded, but his gaze lingered on Maya a moment too long. There was something in his eyes, something dark and unsettling, but SHAQ didn't notice. He was too busy laughing at a joke someone had told, his attention elsewhere. As the clock struck midnight, the family began to say their goodbyes. Andrew and Lisa were the last to leave, promising to come back for Christmas dinner the next day. "Take care of that little girl," Andrew said, clapping SHAQ on the shoulder. "Always," SHAQ replied, his voice firm. The house fell silent as the last guest left. SHAQ and Shawnee cleaned up quietly, not wanting to wake Maya. They carried her upstairs to her bed, tucking her in once more. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," Shawnee whispered, kissing her daughter's cheek. But as they closed the door, Maya stirred in her sleep, a faint frown on her face. For a moment, she thought she heard footsteps outside her room, but she was too tired to open her eyes. She drifted back to sleep, unaware of the shadow that had fallen over her perfect Christmas Eve. The next morning, Maya woke up to the sound of her parents laughing downstairs. The sun streamed through her curtains, casting a warm glow on her room. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the excitement of Christmas morning. Then, remembering the presents waiting under the tree, she jumped out of bed and ran downstairs. "Daddy! Mommy! It's Christmas!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the house. SHAQ was already in the living room, holding a cup of coffee and grinning as he watched Maya's eyes light up at the sight of the presents. The tree was surrounded by colorful boxes and shiny wrapping paper, and Maya clapped her hands in delight. "Santa came!" she exclaimed, dropping to her knees in front of the tree. "Of course he did," SHAQ said, sitting down beside her. "You've been a good girl this year, right?" Maya nodded vigorously, her curls bouncing. "The best." Shawnee joined them, holding a plate of cinnamon rolls. "Let's see what Santa brought you," she said, handing Maya the first present. Maya tore into the wrapping paper, her excitement growing with each gift. There were dolls, books, a new bike, and even a tablet for kids. But her favorite gift was a stuffed unicorn that matched her pajamas. She hugged it tightly, her smile lighting up the room. "Thank you, Santa," she said, looking up at her parents. "You're welcome, baby girl," SHAQ said, pulling her into a hug. The rest of the morning was filled with laughter and joy. The family ate breakfast together, played with Maya's new toys, and watched Christmas movies. But as the day went on, Maya began to feel a strange unease. She couldn't shake the memory of the footsteps she thought she'd heard outside her room last night. "Daddy?" she asked during a quiet moment. "Yeah, Princess?" SHAQ replied, looking down at her. "Did you come into my room last night?" SHAQ frowned, shaking his head. "No, why?" Maya hesitated, unsure how to explain the feeling she'd had. "I thought I heard someone." SHAQ's expression softened, and he knelt down to her level. "It was probably just the house settling, or maybe Santa checking on you. Don't worry, okay? You're safe here." Maya nodded, but the uneasy feeling stayed with her. Later that afternoon, the family gathered for Christmas dinner. Uncle Andrew and Aunt Lisa arrived, along with a few other relatives. The house was once again filled with laughter and chatter, but Maya found it hard to join in. She kept glancing at Andrew, who seemed to be watching her more than usual. "Maya, come here," Andrew called, patting the seat next to him on the couch. Maya hesitated, but her parents were busy in the kitchen, and she didn't want to seem rude. She walked over and sat down, clutching her stuffed unicorn. "You've gotten so big," Andrew said, his voice soft. "You're not a little girl anymore, are you?" Maya shook her head, unsure how to respond. Andrew reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch made her skin crawl, but she didn't know how to pull away. "You're such a pretty girl," he said, his eyes lingering on her. Maya felt a knot form in her stomach. She wanted to leave, but she didn't want to upset him. "Maya, come help me set the table," Shawnee called from the kitchen. Maya jumped up, relieved for the excuse to leave. "Coming, Mommy." As she helped her mother set the table, Maya tried to push the uncomfortable encounter out of her mind. But as the evening went on, she couldn't shake the feeling of Andrew's eyes on her. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room to play games. Maya sat between her parents, trying to focus on the fun, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Andrew. She noticed him watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable. When it was time for bed, Maya felt a wave of relief. She hugged her parents goodnight and climbed the stairs to her room. But as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She was almost asleep when she heard the creak of her bedroom door opening. Her heart raced as she saw Andrew's silhouette in the doorway. "Maya?" he whispered, stepping inside. Maya froze, her breath catching in her throat. "I just wanted to check on you," Andrew said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "You seemed upset earlier." Maya didn't know what to say. She wanted to scream, to call for her parents, but fear kept her silent. Andrew reached out, brushing her cheek with his hand. "You're such a special girl," he said, his voice low. Maya's eyes filled with tears as she realized what was happening. She wanted to run, to fight, but she was too scared to move. When it was over, Andrew stood up, smoothing his clothes. "Don't tell anyone, okay?" he said, his tone calm but firm. "This is our little secret." Maya nodded, her tears spilling over. Andrew left the room, closing the door behind him. Maya lay in the dark, her body trembling with fear and shame. She didn't understand what had happened, but she knew it was wrong. She wanted to tell her parents, but Andrew's words echoed in her mind. "Don't tell anyone." So she stayed silent, burying her face in her pillow and crying herself to sleep. The days after Christmas passed in a blur for Maya. She tried to act normal, to smile and laugh like she always did, but something inside her had changed. The joy she'd felt on Christmas morning was gone, replaced by a heavy weight she couldn't explain. At first, her parents didn't notice anything wrong. SHAQ was busy with work, and Shawnee was caught up in planning a New Year's party. But as the weeks went by, Maya's behavior began to change. She stopped playing with her toys, leaving her new bike untouched in the garage. She stopped laughing at her father's jokes, her smile replaced by a distant, blank expression. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of that night over and over. "Maya, are you feeling okay?" Shawnee asked one morning as she packed Maya's lunch for school. Maya nodded, but her eyes were downcast. "You've been so quiet lately," Shawnee said, crouching down to her level. "Is something bothering you?" Maya shook her head, her throat tightening. She wanted to tell her mother the truth, but the words wouldn't come. SHAQ noticed the change too. One evening, as he tucked Maya into bed, he asked, "What's going on, princess?" "You're not yourself lately." Maya looked at her father, her eyes filled with tears. For a moment she thought about telling him everything, but then she remembered Andrew's warning. "Don't tell anyone." "I'm just tired," she whispered, turning away from him. SHAQ frowned, brushing a hand over her hair. "Okay, baby girl. Get some rest, and we'll talk tomorrow, okay?" Maya nodded, but she knew she wouldn't tell him. She couldn't. At school, Maya's teachers began to notice her struggles. She was falling behind in her work, her once bright eyes now dull and unfocused. During recess, she sat alone on the playground, watching the other kids play but never joining in. "Maya, is everything okay at home?" her teacher, Mrs. Thompson, asked one day. Maya nodded, but her lower lip trembled. Mrs. Thompson knelt down, her voice gentle. "You know you can talk to me if something's wrong, right? I'm here to help you." Maya looked at her teacher, her heart pounding. For a moment, she considered telling her the truth. But then she thought about Andrew, about what he might do if she told. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Thompson sighed, patting Maya's shoulder. "Okay, sweetheart. But if you ever need to talk, I'm here." Maya nodded, but she knew she wouldn't say anything. At home, the tension continued to grow. SHAQ and Shawnee tried to get Maya to open up, but she refused to talk. They took her to the doctor, thinking she might be sick, but the tests came back normal. "Maybe it's just a phase," Shawnee said one night as she and SHAQ sat in the kitchen, discussing their daughter's behavior. "I don't know," SHAQ replied, his voice heavy with worry. "She's not herself. Something's wrong, but I don't know how to help her." Shawnee reached out, squeezing his hand. "We'll figure it out. She just needs time." But time didn't seem to help. If anything, Maya's condition worsened. She began having nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. SHAQ and Shawnee would rush to her room, holding her until she calmed down, but she never told them what she was dreaming about. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, SHAQ sat on the edge of Maya's bed, his face etched with concern. "Maya, you have to tell me what's wrong," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I can't help you if you don't talk to me." Maya looked at her father, her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to tell him, to let him protect her like he always did. But the fear was too strong. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Of what?" SHAQ asked, his heart breaking at the sight of his daughter's pain. Maya shook her head, her tears spilling over. "I can't tell you." SHAQ pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "You don't have to be scared, Maya. I'm here. I'll always protect you." Maya buried her face in his chest, sobbing. She wanted to believe him, but the fear was too deep. As the weeks turned into months, Maya's health began to decline. She lost her appetite, her cheeks growing pale and hollow. She complained of stomach aches and headaches, but the doctors couldn't find anything wrong. One morning, as Shawnee helped Maya get ready for school, she noticed something strange. Maya's stomach seemed swollen, her clothes tighter than usual. "Maya, have you been eating too much candy?" Shawnee asked, trying to make light of the situation. Maya shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. Shawnee's heart sank as she realized something was seriously wrong. "Maya, we need to take you to the doctor again." Maya nodded, but she didn't say anything. She knew what was coming, and she was terrified. The doctor's office was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy and suffocating. Maya sat on the examination table, her legs dangling over the edge, her hands clutching the hem of her shirt. She stared at the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. SHAQ and Shawnee stood nearby, their faces etched with worry. The doctor, a kind woman with gentle eyes, examined Maya carefully. She asked questions about her symptoms, her diet, and her daily routine. Maya answered in short, quiet sentences, her voice barely above a whisper. When the doctor finished the physical exam, she stepped back, her expression serious. "I'd like to run some tests," she said, looking at SHAQ and Shawnee, "just to rule out any underlying issues." SHAQ nodded, his jaw tight. "Whatever you need to do." Maya's stomach churned as the nurse drew blood and took urine samples. She felt like she was in a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. She wanted to scream, to tell them everything, but the fear kept her silent. The doctor returned a short while later, her face unreadable. "The results are back," she said, glancing at Maya before turning to SHAQ and Shawnee. "Can we speak privately?" SHAQ's heart sank. He nodded, following the doctor into the hallway. Shawnee stayed with Maya, holding her hand tightly. In the hallway, the doctor took a deep breath. "I'm afraid the results are concerning," she said, her voice low. "Maya is pregnant." SHAQ's world stopped. He stared at the doctor, his mind refusing to process the words. "What?" he finally managed to say, his voice shaking. "I know this is a shock," the doctor said gently. "But the tests are clear. Maya is approximately 3 months along." SHAQ felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His little girl, his baby, was pregnant. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. How is this possible?" he asked, his voice breaking. The doctor hesitated, her expression sympathetic. "I think it's important to talk to Maya. She may be able to give us some answers." SHAQ nodded numbly, his mind racing. He walked back into the room, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. Shawnee looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. SHAQ knelt down in front of Maya, his hands shaking as he took hers. "Maya," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "The doctor says you're pregnant." Shawnee gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What?" Maya's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her lap. "Maya, you need to tell us what happened," SHAQ said, his voice firm but gentle. "Who did this to you?" Maya shook her head, her tears spilling over. "I can't," she whispered. "Yes, you can," SHAQ said, his heart breaking at the sight of her pain. "You're safe now. No one can hurt you. Just tell us the truth." Maya looked at her father, her lower lip trembling. For a moment she hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost inaudible, she said, "It was Uncle Andrew." SHAQ's blood ran cold. He felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "Andrew?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya nodded, her tears streaming down her face. He came into my room on Christmas Eve. He told me not to tell anyone." SHAQ's hands clenched into fists, his entire body shaking with rage. He wanted to scream, to break something, to find Andrew and make him pay. But he forced himself to stay calm, for Maya's sake. "You're so brave for telling us," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Maya. We're going to make this right, okay?" "I promise." Maya nodded, her small body trembling. SHAQ stood up, his mind racing. He turned to Shawnee, who was crying silently, her hand still covering her mouth. "Call the police," he said, his voice firm. "We're pressing charges." Shawnee nodded, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. SHAQ knelt down in front of Maya again, his eyes filled with determination. "No one is ever going to hurt you again," he said, his voice steady. "I'm going to protect you, no matter what." Maya looked at her father, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and hope. For the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The police station was a stark contrast to the warmth of the O'Neill home. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled of stale coffee and paperwork. SHAQ sat in a small, sterile room, his massive frame hunched over a table as he spoke to a detective. His voice was steady, but his hands clenched and unclenched as he recounted what Maya had told him. "She said it was her uncle, Andrew," SHAQ said, his jaw tight. "He's a police chief in another district. He came into her room on Christmas Eve and hurt her." The detective, a middle-aged man with a tired but kind face, nodded slowly. "This is a serious accusation," he said, his tone careful. "Do you have any evidence to support it?" SHAQ's eyes flashed with anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "My daughter is 7 years old and she's pregnant. Isn't that evidence enough?" The detective held up a hand. I understand your frustration, Mr. O'Neill. But we need to handle this carefully, especially given Andrew's position. We'll need to conduct a full investigation. SHAQ nodded, though every fiber of his being wanted to storm out and confront Andrew himself. Just do your job, he said, his voice low. My daughter deserves justice. Meanwhile, Maya sat in another room with her mother and a female officer. The officer, a gentlewoman named Officer Martinez, spoke softly as she asked Maya questions. Maya, can you tell me what happened on Christmas Eve? Officer Martinez asked, her voice calm and reassuring. Maya looked down at her hands, her heart racing. She wanted to tell the truth, but the fear was still there, gnawing at her. It's okay, Officer Martinez said, leaning forward slightly. You're safe here. No one can hurt you now. Maya took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she began to speak. Uncle Andrew came into my room, she said, her words barely above a whisper. He touched me. He told me not to tell anyone. Officer Martinez nodded, her expression sympathetic. You're very brave for telling us, Maya. This is an important step in making sure he can't hurt anyone else. Maya looked up at her mother, who was crying silently, her hand covering her mouth. Shawnee reached out, taking Maya's hand and squeezing it tightly. I'm so proud of you, baby, Shawnee said, her voice breaking. You're so strong. As the investigation began, the O'Neill family faced an uphill battle. Andrew, as a police chief, had connections and influence. He used every resource at his disposal to delay the case, intimidate witnesses, and cast doubt on Maya's story. This is ridiculous, SHAQ said one evening, pacing the living room. He's using his position to protect himself. How is that fair? Shawnee sat on the couch, her face pale and drawn. We have to trust the system, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. The system? SHAQ snapped, his frustration boiling over. The system is failing us, failing Maya. Maya, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, flinched at her father's raised voice. SHAQ immediately regretted his outburst. He walked over to her, kneeling down and taking her hands in his. I'm sorry, baby girl, he said, his voice soft. I didn't mean to scare you. Maya nodded, her eyes filled with tears. Is Uncle Andrew going to get in trouble? She asked, her voice small. SHAQ's heart broke at the fear in her voice. Yes, Maya, he said firmly. He's going to pay for what he did. I promise. As the weeks went by, the case gained media attention. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was everywhere. Headlines like SHAQ O'Neill's daughter assaulted by police chief uncle and family betrayal, a 7-year-old's fight for justice, dominated the news. Social media exploded with support for Maya and SHAQ. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #ProtectOurChildren trended worldwide. People shared their own stories of abuse, and the case became a rallying cry for survivors everywhere. But with the attention came scrutiny. Andrew's defense team launched a smear campaign, trying to discredit Maya and her family. They claimed Maya was confused, that she had misunderstood what happened. They even suggested SHAQ was using his fame to manipulate the case. SHAQ refused to back down. He held press conferences, his voice steady and determined, as he spoke about the importance of protecting children and holding abusers accountable. This isn't about fame or revenge, he said at one press conference, his eyes blazing with conviction. This is about my daughter. This is about every child who's ever been hurt and silenced. We will not be silenced anymore. The public rallied behind him. Protests were organized outside courthouses demanding justice for Maya. Celebrities, activists, and ordinary people alike voiced their support. But the fight was far from over. The trial loomed ahead, and SHAQ knew it would be the hardest battle of his life. The courthouse was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashing as SHAQ and Shawnee walked in, holding Maya's hands tightly. Maya wore a simple dress, her hair tied back with a ribbon, her face pale, but determined. She clung to her stuffed unicorn, her small fingers gripping it tightly. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense. Andrew sat at the defense table, his expression calm and composed. He wore a tailored suit, his posture confident, as if he were untouchable. SHAQ glared at him from across the room, his fists clenched at his sides. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Angela Carter, stood and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and strong. "This case is about betrayal. It's about a man who abused his position of trust to harm a child, his own niece. Maya O'Neill is 7 years old. She should be playing with dolls and dreaming about Santa Claus. Instead, she's here today, bravely facing the man who hurt her." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Andrew O'Neill is guilty of this heinous crime. Justice must be served, not just for Maya, but for every child who has ever been silenced." Andrew's defense attorney, a slick man named Robert Hayes, stood next. He adjusted his tie and smiled at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, "this case is not as simple as it seems. My client is a respected police chief, a man who has dedicated his life to serving and protecting others. The accusations against him are baseless, fueled by emotion and misunderstanding. We will show that there is no concrete evidence linking him to this crime. This is a tragic case of a child's confusion being exploited for personal gain." SHAQ's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He glanced at Maya, who was sitting between him and Shawnee, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," he whispered, squeezing her hand. "You're safe." The first witness called was Maya. The room fell silent as she walked to the stand, her small figure dwarfed by the chair. The judge smiled kindly at her. "Maya, do you promise to tell the truth?" the judge asked. Maya nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes." Angela Carter approached the stand, her tone gentle. "Maya, can you tell us what happened on Christmas Eve?" Maya hesitated, her heart pounding. She looked at her parents, who nodded encouragingly. Then, in a soft but clear voice, she began to speak. "Uncle Andrew came into my room," she said, her words trembling. He touched me. He told me not to tell anyone." The room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Angela nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Thank you, Maya. You're being very brave." Robert Hayes stood for cross-examination. He approached the stand, his smile unnerving. "Maya," he said, his tone overly sweet, "you're a very imaginative little girl, aren't you?" Maya frowned, confused. I don't know." "You like to play pretend, don't you?" he pressed. "Sometimes," Maya admitted. "Is it possible," Hayes continued, his voice dripping with false kindness, "that you imagined what happened with your uncle? Maybe you had a bad dream and got confused?" Maya's eyes filled with tears. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "It wasn't a dream." SHAQ's hands clenched into fists, but he stayed silent. He wanted to leap over the railing and confront Hayes, but he knew he had to let the process play out. The next witness was the doctor who had examined Maya. She testified about the pregnancy and the physical evidence of abuse. "The findings are consistent with Maya's account," the doctor said firmly. "There's no doubt in my mind that she was assaulted." Hayes tried to poke holes in her testimony, but the doctor held her ground. As the trial continued, more evidence was presented. Text messages between Andrew and his wife that hinted at his guilt, testimony from family members who had noticed his inappropriate behavior, and forensic evidence linking him to the crime. But Andrew's defense team fought back hard. They called witnesses who testified to his good character, painting him as a devoted family man and dedicated officer. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Maya's testimony was unreliable. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day more grueling than the last. SHAQ and Shawnee sat through every minute, their hearts breaking as they watched Maya relive her trauma. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable. SHAQ held Maya's hand tightly as the jury filed in. The judge turned to the jury foreman. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor." SHAQ's heart pounded as the foreman read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Andrew O'Neill, guilty on all charges." The room erupted. SHAQ pulled Maya into a tight hug, tears streaming down his face. Shawnee sobbed beside them, her hands covering her mouth. Andrew's face went pale, his confident demeanor crumbling. He was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed. As they left the courthouse, SHAQ held Maya in his arms, shielding her from the flashing cameras. "It's over, baby girl," he whispered. "You're safe now." Maya buried her face in his shoulder, her tears soaking his shirt. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions for the O'Neill family. Andrew was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a victory that felt bittersweet. While justice had been served, the scars of what had happened would take time to heal. SHAQ and Shawnee focused all their energy on helping Maya recover. They enrolled her in therapy, where she could talk about her feelings in a safe and supportive environment. At first, Maya was hesitant, her trust in others shattered. But slowly, with the help of her therapist, she began to open up. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult session, Maya sat on the couch with her stuffed unicorn, staring out the window. SHAQ sat down beside her, his large frame making the couch dip slightly. "How are you feeling, Princess?" he asked, his voice gentle. Maya shrugged, her fingers tracing the unicorn's horn. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I just feel sad." SHAQ nodded, his heart aching for her. "That's okay," he said. "It's okay to feel sad. What happened to you was really hard, and it's going to take time to feel better. But you're not alone, okay? Mommy and I are here for you, no matter what." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Do you think I'll ever be happy again?" SHAQ pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "Yes, Maya," he said, his voice firm. "You will. It might take a while, but you're so strong. You've already been so brave. And I know you're going to get through this." Maya buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. As the months went by, Maya began to heal. She started to smile again, to laugh, to play with her toys. She still had bad days, days when the memories were too much to bear, but she was learning how to cope. SHAQ and Shawnee were there for her every step of the way. They made sure she felt safe and loved, surrounding her with positivity and support. They also became advocates for survivors of abuse, using their platform to raise awareness and push for change. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Maya looked up at her parents. "I want to help other kids like me," she said, her voice steady. SHAQ and Shawnee exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with pride. "That's a wonderful idea, Maya," Shawnee said, reaching out to take her hand. "How do you want to help?" Maya thought for a moment. "Maybe we can start a foundation," she said, "to help kids who've been hurt and make sure they get the help they need." SHAQ smiled, his eyes filling with tears. "That's an amazing idea, baby girl. We'll do it together, okay?" Maya nodded, a small smile spreading across her face. The O'Neill family launched the Maya's Hope Foundation a few months later. The foundation provided resources and support for survivors of abuse, including counseling, legal assistance, and educational programs. It quickly gained traction, with people from all over the world donating and volunteering. Maya became the face of the foundation, her bravery inspiring others to speak out and seek help. She gave interviews, attended events, and even spoke at schools, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up against abuse. 1 year after the trial, the O'Neill family celebrated Christmas again. This time, the house was filled with laughter and joy, the shadows of the past year finally beginning to fade. Maya stood in front of the Christmas tree, her eyes sparkling as she looked at the presents underneath. SHAQ and Shawnee stood behind her, their arms around each other. "This is the best Christmas ever," Maya said, turning to her parents with a smile. SHAQ knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "You're the best Christmas present we could ever ask for, Maya," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Maya hugged him back, her heart full. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly happy. As the family gathered around the tree, opening presents and laughing together, Maya felt a sense of peace. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she also knew she wasn't alone. She had her family, her foundation, and a future filled with hope. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. Let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. Also, subscribe the channel for daily stories notification.